Guys, welcome back. I'll be honest, I've spent like 5 hours today editing a live stream. On Wednesday, Games Workshop released a new FAQ, which affects the entirety of the game because it's massive changes to the core rules. It's also a massive change to half the Codex is available on the shelf. And on Wednesday, we went through every update, every change in the game and went through them and kind of like explained them live to make a cheat sheet called What the FAQ It Means. And I was trying to edit that live stream into a video, but the live stream ended up being like over 3 hours. So instead, I'm just going to go through the cheat sheet and kind of give you like a rough overview of what each bit means. If you don't want to watch this video, that's okay. That's on you. There's a link in the description to an IMGA. It's a big cheat sheet. It's right there. It explains everything that's mentioned. You can just go look at it. Or you can listen to me ramble and go through it instead. If you want to see live streams like this, I do live stream every Monday and Wednesday at 6 PM on twitch.tv/Hellstormwargaming. I do stream here on Monday as well on YouTube, but I do stream on Wednesdays in addition exclusively to Twitch, where we do like a 40k show, such as the seminar, such as the cheat sheet. So if you want to check that out, please give me a follow. There's a link in the description, but otherwise, here's a cheat sheet. So here it is. We made it in Photoshop. It's like 500 layers. None of them are sorted, none of them are labeled correctly. So what the FAQ it means, 2021 core rules. So I've basically took out all the things that actually make a difference to the game, a lot of things where there's like interesting interactions, such as setting up reinforcements. Obviously, we made a video a couple of weeks ago called Maths is Breaking Warhammer. Because of Pythagoras, we kind of like went into like why it works, why it shouldn't work, what's wrong with it. But essentially, Games Workshop have completely annihilated that instance of what should happen. And now, when you deep strike, everything has to be more than 9 inches away horizontally, which means you can no longer deep strike on top of buildings. You can only deep strike 9 inches away, and they've explicitly stated that you can never get a better than a 9-inch charge out of deep strike. The only instance is this one, which on page 256, where you can come on your own deployment zone edge. So that's the only time you can ever get less than a 9-inch charge without like buffing the dice. For example, Blood Angels +1 to charge. So there's basically like no shenanigans. And yes, we did fix Warhammer all by ourselves. We also added this one called If Every Unit in Your Army. Basically, pretty much every army that's been released is getting unique rules if you are totally unique in terms of your faction. For example, Deathguard, which is a great example for this change. Deathguard gain the Contagion ability, which is the -1 toughness aura that grows as the game goes on. They gain this if they're totally Deathguard when the game starts. Now, it was weird. No one really knew what happened. If you summoned later on in the game, are you still pure Deathguard? And now they've clarified you do. So you check if you're in every unit in your army for benefiting rules and getting bonuses when you muster your army. From that point, you can add to it as you like. So basically, yes, you can summon in Deathguard and not break Contagion. Start of deployment. There are some abilities that say at the start of deployment. They've specified this is at step 10, which basically like clarifies when combat squads happens, which essentially means when you say that you're going to put stuff in reserve, this is actually the start of deployment. Everything before that is before the start, and everything after is after the start. The has access to psychic disciplines, etc. Update essentially just affects the Tome of Malcador, which is a space marine relic, which allows you to take 1 extra power that the psychic has access to. Essentially what they've said is when a Psyker knows multiple disciplines and can choose from one type of discipline, they lock themselves out of the other ones. So the Tome of Malcador only allows you to take 1 extra power from the same discipline they already know. I posted this cheat sheet on competitive 40k with this in, and someone told me I was wrong. It says it there, right there. Subtract 2 inches when making a normal move, advance or fallback, charge over terrain. Which basically has the difficult ground feature. So this is all about difficult ground. It basically means that Knights and Fly and Deathguard totally ignore craters and stuff like that, all similar when making moves. So they don't lose the -2 to move when they go for woods or craters or etc. As long as it's less than 3 inches in height. Now, they also clarified how strike first / strike last work, because it can be quite confusing. I've kind of given like a running order of what means what. So obviously strike first means you fight first in the combat. When you charge, you essentially gain strike first as a rule. You have strike first, then normal strikers, so people who haven't charged or don't have a strike first ability, and then you have strike last. There's a little add-on for this, which is basically when you strike first, if an ability has a strike first or you charged, the active player whose turn it is goes first. Then when you go to normal, so people who haven't charged or have had their strike first knocked off, then it goes to the non-active player who chooses first, and then it goes to strike last. So basically the active player chooses again. If you have something that says you are not eligible to fight until other units have fought, that means you can't use the interrupt stratagem, the 2 CP one, to fight next, essentially. And then it says that if you have fight first and then have fight last tagged onto you, then you count as not charging, or essentially you're in the normal bracket, you're right back in the middle. And strike first and strike last don't stack. It's just like if you've got 5 strike firsts and 1 strike last, you just strike as normal, and vice versa. They actually released a designer's commentary to this as well, since I made this cheat sheet, so you can go check that out as well if you really need to know. There's this really interesting one called Rare Rules and Resurrected Models. Essentially what this means is when you are shot in the shooting phase, you have to technically allocate a hit to one model, and that one model has to keep taking hits until they die. This essentially clarifies that if you lose a model and it gets resurrected, such as, for example, Gumballina's comment about a Lich Guard getting back up, you don't have to allocate it to the same model that just got back up. It's essentially like a fresh model that hasn't been hit yet when it revives. So you can reallocate the hits to a different model after resurrection protocols and stuff like that. This one, Rare Rules and Repossession or replacement units, essentially means that when you have abilities that allow you redeploy in the movement phase, this is pretty much at any time in the movement phase. For example, the Solar Flare in the Mechanicus Codex says in your movement phase you can use this relic to redeploy 2 units. Essentially what this means is it can be used at the start, at the end, or in the middle. There's no like real timing, and they've clarified that there's no timing. So you could like deep strike a unit and then use the Solar Flare to redeploy it if you really wanted to. Don't know why you would, but you might need it for one day. But you can do it. But this is only during the movement phase. If there's any other abilities such as the jump, you can't do it. Attacks that make multiple hit rolls. Now, this was really popular with the Deathguard Codex, or well, for the 8th edition Deathguard Codex with Plague Flails, and it's been super popular with Competitive Edge and a Razor Flail for a Succubus, where essentially they roll extra attacks after they've rolled their initial attacks. And you have weapons such as the Razor Flail that say, when they make an attack with this weapon, roll 2 hit rolls instead of 1. Essentially, they've said that you cannot do that anymore. Once you've rolled the attacks and done that, if you have any extra hits, they can't generate more hits, and you can't use them to make 2 hit rolls instead of 1, and they can't explode afterwards. For example, if a 6 to hit, you make 1 extra attack, like Death to the False Emperor, what you would normally do is roll to hit, roll a 6 with a Plague Flail, for example. You roll a 6 to hit, so you make an extra attack. When you make an attack with a Plague Flail, you make 2 attacks for each hit roll. So you'd roll 2 extra attacks, but now that basically says it doesn't do that, and also you can't explode it again. Rules for that count as remaining stationary were quite interesting, because there was a big debate when this first came out for Tau Monka, which essentially is a once per game ability from the commanders that say everyone can count as remaining stationary when they go to shoot, no matter what they do in the movement phase. And there's lots of like really interesting interactions that came out and lots of disagreements. But essentially they've confirmed that if you fall back or advance, but then count as remaining stationary, you count as remaining stationary, so you can still shoot even if you fall back, unless you're Ultramarines, because they say you can't. So it's very dependent on what their special rule says, but Tal Monka, for example, says you can shoot as if you remain stationary. That's it. There's no other like stipulation, so they can do that. The only stipulation to this as well is if you arrive from reinforcements and you have a rule that says you count as remaining stationary, you don't count as remaining stationary, which means stuff like suppressors, deep striking, or coming from strategic reserves, they can't count as remaining stationary, so they'll actually be -1 to hit because they carry heavy weapons. Again, the last one, this kind of like stipulates that it doesn't work for actions. It pretty much works for everything else in the game, mostly shooting, but especially not action. So you can't advance or fall back and then perform an action even though you've technically remained stationary, but you can shoot as if you remain stationary, which is kind of why it's contradicting, but it's just one of those things. Psychic powers that modify characteristics and additional effects. Essentially what this means is when you have a psychic power, when you have like multiple effects that happen at once, they happen at the same time, they don't happen sequentially, they don't happen one after another. For example, Engulfing Fear, which is a Dark Angel's power. This actually came up in a battle report between Dark Angels and the new Drakari in the brand new Codex. Essentially what this means is that the more, for this example, you reduce the leadership by 1, and then if you cast over the leadership, you take more wounds. Now, essentially, you look at the leadership characteristic before you cast this power, rather than making them -1 leadership and then being like, oh, actually, because you're -1 leadership, now you take more wounds. It doesn't work like that way. Now it's just like, it just happens at the same time, so you don't consider the -1 leadership when checking the more wounds ability. You check them both at the same time. Simultaneous versus sequential, basically. Preventing/losing objectives secured. Essentially what this means is if you have objectives secured or you have double objectives secured, like Necrons, If you have something that makes you lose objectives secured, it just cancels it out completely. You don't have anything. And that's essentially what it means. There's no real, like, not much else to say about that. It's just like, if you have anything that cancels OBSEC, it doesn't matter what you have, you don't have OBSEC whatsoever. It overrules all other rules, which makes it really strong. For this one, modifying the command pointer stratagems, essentially there's like a really interesting debate with Vect. Again, this came up in the Drukhari versus Dark Angels game as well. Essentially, because the Chief Apothecary can take a warlord trait called Selfless Healer. Selfless Healer says when they use the Combat Revival stratagem, the stratagem's cost is reduced to 0 CP. Now, it's only 1 CP normally. With Agents of Vect, you can make it plus 1 CP, or cost 1 more CP to make it 2 CP. But then the timing essentially said that the Chief Apothecary, every time he uses the stratagem, he reduces it to 0 CP. He doesn't reduce the cost by 1. He doesn't say it is 1 cheaper or anything like that. He just reduces it to 0 CP. So it doesn't matter if Combat Revival would actually cost like 50 CP with loads of abilities, you know, with like 49 Vex, for example. That can't be done, but let's say it did. Combat Revival is now a 50 CP stratagem. When Chief Apothecary uses it with Selfless Healer, he then reduces it to 0 because that's what the ability says. He doesn't reduce the cost by 1, he just reduces it to 0 CP. They've essentially just said, no, actually it does cost 1 CP. This is basically what this says. We wrote the timing all wrong, so it is 1 CP after all. So in this instance, Vect would make Combat Revival. Essentially, the order of this now would be the stratagem is 1 CP. Selfless Healer makes the cost 0 CP, and then Vect adds 1 CP back on. Bit daft, but it also works with Charger's Moment Shackle as well, from the Custodes Codex. For this one, add the following: move X, etc, etc. Essentially, this little snippet is from one of my rules packs. It basically means that if you have a rule that says you have to move a certain distance, you actually have to move a certain distance. You can't move forward 6 inches, move back 6 inches. That doesn't count as moving 12. That's kind of like we saw with Ravenwing. They'd be like, okay, I've moved 1 inch and move back, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I moved over 12 now, so now I'm going to kill someone and get points. Where they basically said, no, you have to try and move 12 inches away. You have to actually move 12 inches from the starting distance. And that's pretty much it for core rules. They're all the core rules changes, and I'm going to go through all of the other books that got updated, and we'll kind of like explain roughly what they do as well. Pariah Nexus, we learned that it's still not worth your money because there was just a page number net change. In the Faith and Fury, there was something removed that we couldn't quite find, so we're not really sure what changed there. We imagine it was probably something that's just been clarified in the core rules now instead. In Blood of Baal, we've seen that the Exocrine can fall back and shoot normal / twice with +1 hit because their stratagem says they count as remaining stationary, and then it triggers back to the core rules, which basically says if you remain stationary, you can fall back and shoot in advance or whatever. So they can basically fall back and shoot at normal or twice with +1 to hit. They don't count as moving, they don't count as falling back. The only reason these guys can't advance is because it says they have not advanced this turn. With Thousand Suns, essentially they've had their warp time change from Heretic Astartes units, so basically any Chaos Space Marine, to just Thousand Suns units, which means basically you can't put in a Thousand Suns detachment to warp time Mortarion or anything else that is from Chaos. They can only warp time their own faction now. In the Space Marines Codex, we saw a guerrilla tactics change. This is essentially a Phobos specific stratagem where essentially you could deep strike and then return to the sky straight away in the same turn, in the same phase. But now they basically said you can't do it. You can't go from reserves back into reserves in the same turn. The other one talking about teleport homers, Armorium Cherubs, and Watchers in the Dark, which are essentially like abilities, or essentially like the like models part of the squad, but they're not really, they're just an ability. Essentially, when you buy one of these and then combat squad a unit, so split that squad into 2, it was kind of like confusing whether which unit would take the cherub or the homer, but now it doesn't matter. Essentially, they both have it until one unit's used it, so they both have access to the ability, but there's only enough resources to use it once, which is kind of like a really strong ability, because you could like take a Devastator squad and split it into 2, and now both of them technically have a cherub until one of them's used it, which is actually really, really good. Gives you lots of flexibility as a Space Marine player, which you already have. Or Necrons have basically clarified that the Silent King doesn't benefit from the Serachian bonus because he's a dynastic advisor, but he does get access to the stratagem that is in there from their faction as well, which is kind of nice. Now, there's quite a few changes for Drukhari, understandably, because they are a really strong faction. There's a lot wrong with them right now. but they've kind of changed some stuff and then not changed some others. So from the article, they implied that all auto-hitting weapons wouldn't benefit from Dark Technomancers, but the actual update in the FAQ says that liquefiers are excluded from the Dark Technomancers buffs. This is basically getting +1 damage and +1 to wound, but you essentially, on a hit roll of a 1, you die, so it essentially turns everything into a plasma gun. Liquefiers auto-hit, so they don't like actually suffer from that, so it's really broken. You saw like 15 racks in every list. But they can't do that anymore. However, there is the Kronos that has the Spirit Siphon, which is still auto hits, but is not excluded from Dark Technomancers. They're looking like they're in a really good spot still, which is actually kind of cool. Don't know if this is an oversight. Should they get limited as well? Don't know. Let me know down in the comments. And then obviously we've talked about the Succubus as well, which can't get exploding hits as we talked about in the core rules. Raiding Forces. So this one is essentially you can take multiple patrols, and it says if you take just Drakari patrols in your army, then essentially all patrols have their command cost to 0. But because of the patrol, it says if you have your Warlord in one of them, you gain 2 CP, because normally you'd lose 2 CP for taking that patrol, so it essentially cancels it out. Drakari essentially got +2 CP because they take 3 patrols that cost 0 CP because it's all Drakari. And then they've got the Warlord in one of them, so then they gain 2 CP, so now it's just, now you just don't get anything. So you start with 12 like everyone else. And also there's been +10 points on both Drazar and Raider, which are both like very strong units, so now they're 145 and 195. Now chapter approved, when it does come out, it's probably going to like be lower. The Drazar and Raider probably aren't going to be hit, but it's safe to say that these new points are going to be overtaking chapter approved, which is coming out when I'm recording tomorrow. Now, Deathguard received a huge change by mostly just removal of stuff. So they had some really weird FAQ/clarification about how inexorable advance works, which essentially means they can't have their movement modified. But then they said that you could if you were hitting a crater, but only in the charge phase and only if the winds was traveling at 69.420 miles per hour, then you would get affected by it. It didn't really make any sense, but they've had all of that removed, as well as the clarifications from difficult ground earlier in the core rules. Essentially, Deathguard ignore all movement penalties again, which is where they really should be. It just kind of makes no sense. There's also really weird wording where Typhus said they could go in any detachment but didn't break it, but he actually did break it, and they've updated that now. And for Deathguard in the Forge World units, the Bloat Drone gets Contagions of Nurgle as well, like the rest of the Codex. For Craft World, we learned that Games Workshop don't like using the Strike Through ability, which is a very easy ability that every person in Warhammer has access to, because they removed a load of stuff from this, but then it's hard to like analyze the changes because it's not there anymore. But essentially, because it said you could advance as part of a Quicken move, which Quicken lets you move as if it was movement phase. Quicken specifically said you could advance, but in the core rules it says when you make a move that as if it was the movement phase, but it's not the movement phase, you can't advance. Basically remove that, so now Quicken is like everyone else. Chaos Space Marines looks very familiar. The same change as Thousand Suns, it's now Legion locked, so you can't use Word Bearers to cast on World Eaters anymore. Now Sealup Oath got an update. It was really broken before because they just wrote it really badly. You chose a unit at the start of the game, and then all units within 6 inches reroll hits and wounds when targeting that unit. Then they updated it for 9th edition where it says you choose a unit, and then all core and character units reroll hits and wounds, full stop. So just broke it. And then they changed it again where it said something along the lines of choose a unit, and then in the shooting phase choose a unit or something like that. It was just completely wrong. Thankfully they fixed it now, so essentially it goes back to what it should be. Choose a unit at the start of the game. Everyone within 6 inches rerolls hits and wounds if they're a core character against the selected unit. Not every unit, and not a different unit every turn. And finally we have Forge World Imperial Armor, which received a big update. Now the Dreadclaws / Charybdis got updated, so essentially they work the same as drop pods now, so they can come in turn 1 and you immediately disembark if you want to, which is really nice. And then we've already seen one of these for the Great Black Drone, but essentially Forge World and Codex units are one and the same. If you've got Admech or you've got Dark Eldar or Deathguard, essentially all of the Forge World units now coincide with the Codex units really well because they have all the same abilities. Because essentially, because they came out before the Codexes and then some keywords got changed, now they essentially have the updated one, so it all works together. And that's it. That is pretty much it, guys. That is FAQ cheat sheet. As we said, there it is in its entirety. If you go to your supermarket, grab a bog roll, shove that in your printer, you can print this out. You might need 2, I reckon, because it's so long. But if not, you can just get the download link on Imgur in the description down below. That's it. Hope it helped. If you did like this video, then please subscribe. Again, check me out on Twitch. I stream there every Monday and Wednesday at 6 PM UK time. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye now.